Welcome back to the Breaking Your Pattern series. Last time we talked about how the influence of how we grew up affects how we show up in relationships. So the things that we learned explicitly and implicitly from the environments that we grew up in, what we call our family of origin, or just our families, and how that shaped the roles that we took on in our life to survive in those family of origin, and how there is a strong likelihood that you're going to repeat those same roles within your adult relationships. Well, today, in this next part of how we break our patterns, is I wanted to focus on our deeper view of self. Now, our view of self is fundamental to what we believe about who we are and how we show up in our relationships. And it might be surprising to you, but primarily our view of self is cemented in our adolescence by age 12 or 13. Of course, that can be shaped over time, but our experiences up until that point really do impact how we view ourselves. And the events that take place in those early years in our life directly impact how we see ourselves. I always remember somebody I spoke to many years ago. They shared a memory with me that when they were in grade 8, do you remember in grade 8 we used to have those graduation dances, those awkward dances as adolescents? Well, when the girls would be on one side of the gymnasium, the guys would be on the other side of the gymnasium, and maybe there'd be some people dancing in the middle. Well, back in his time, it was very much delineated between the guys and the girls on either side. But he decided to make, the courageous walk across that gymnasium floor and ask the prettiest girl to dance. And her immediate response was, unfortunately, to laugh at him. And that was devastating for him. And that cemented his view of self, that I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, and I'm a loser. And we talked about that and how that shaped his view of self and how he showed up in relationships going forward, and it really had a negative impact. But what he didn't realize was that he actually showed a tremendous amount of courage by making that long walk across the floor. And how many other boys in that night, went to bed wondering, what could have happened if I asked that girl to dance? At least he knew, and he knew that wasn't somebody that was worthy of his love because of how she reacted. So these situations and incidents, and also in how we interpret them, directly shape how we determine our deeper view of self. And that comes out in what we describe as couples therapists as our attachment models, or our attachment styles, in other words. And so there's different attachment styles that we develop based on our view of self. And our view of self, to put it simply, is, am I worthy of love and care? And are others reliable and safe? And what I mean by that, I don't mean physically safe, but sometimes that is the case, but more about, are others reliable and safe for me to be able to be vulnerable with them? And so for those who have a positive view of self, we call that secure attachment. And that person believes, I am worthy of love, my needs matter, and that develops into like a secure attachment. In other words, I am comfortable with closeness and independence. I'm able to communicate my needs directly, and I feel less threatened by conflict or distance. And basically, I am able to be vulnerable with the people that I care about. I'm able to kind of share and expose myself because ultimately I feel okay in who I am. The second one we would describe as what we call an anxious attachment style. And these are people who have a negative self-view. They may believe something like, I'm too much, or people could leave if they really see the real me. And they often become anxious and preoccupied with feeling attached or feeling secure. So their typical patterns would be something like, they have a strong fear of abandonment, they have a high sensitivity to rejection, and they seek constant reassurance because they believe their self is less worthy. So the nervous system tries to secure closeness to maintain safety. So they're always like checking in to see, am I okay? They might be the people who are constantly texting or constantly questioning, are we good? Or constantly checking up on where you are. These are people who are seeking reassurance. And then another attachment style is what we call avoidant attachment. So these are people who have like a defensive self-view. Avoidant styles, they often hide a deeper negative self-view behind the sense of independence or avoidance. And their underlying beliefs might be, if I rely on people, I'll get hurt. I must handle everything myself. And the typical patterns would be like emotional distance, discomfort with vulnerability, or downplaying their own needs. Here, they protect themselves by devaluing closeness, saying like, I don't need it, rather than actually being honest with themselves and seeking it. And then there's another attachment style, which we call disorganized attachment. And that person has a fragmented self-view. So when early experiences mix love with fear or unpredictability, the internal view of self becomes unstable. So their typical patterns would be wanting closeness but fearing it. So in other words, they may say, come close but stay away at the same time. So it's confusing or contradictory messages or behavior in relationships, and they often become emotionally overwhelmed. So the self doesn't have a clear strategy for safety. It's confused. Now, why does the self matter so much? Well, your deep self-perception acts like a filter for relationships. If you believe you are worthy, you interpret others' behavior less catastrophically. If you believe you are unworthy, on the other hand, then neutral signals can feel like rejection. They're like a threat. If you believe relying on others is dangerous, closeness absolutely feels threatening. So attachment isn't just about other people. It's about how the self organizes safety and belonging. So therefore, our view of self is directly related to how we show up in relationships. But the important thing that we have to remember is our views of self, these models, these attachment styles are not fixed. They can change. And so they change through our experience in healthy relationships. They can change through therapy. So in our practice, we specialize in couples therapy. And this is what we can help people do, is break these negative patterns into patterns where people feel that they can take risks and be vulnerable and to be healthy, dependent in relationships. It can occur through self-reflection and emotional repair. So there is good news. Even though lots of us grew up in unstable, unhealthy environments, or where even emotional or physical trauma occurred, the good news is that these healthy attachment styles can change. And therapy is a great way to help you do that. So I encourage you, if you are struggling with how you show up in relationships because of your negative view of self, I encourage you to reach out to one of our team, because we are here to help break these patterns, and that is what we specialize in. I'll talk to you soon.